In this segment, we're going to talk about acoustics as they apply to a home recording environment. Now, the topic of acoustics is very, very complex. And as we've seen from the world's experts designing concert halls, it's not always completely predictable. Some things just don't work the way we expect them to. So since it's so complex, we can't spend a lot of time on the details, but we'll talk about some of the major concepts which will help you in your home recording environment. First, we're going to divide the acoustic discussion into two very, very different topics. One has to do with isolation, that is, keeping the sound from outside your studio from getting into your recording, and conversely, the sound that you're making from getting into the outside world and perhaps bothering your neighbors. And the second is the acoustical treatment that's used to make the room sound good. Now, there's a lot of confusion between these two things, but they couldn't be more different. When we're talking about isolation, the thing that provides us with isolation between our recording space and the outside world is mass, or weight. It requires something that's heavy and massive in between you and the outside world in order to stop that sound from transmitting right through the barrier. This is an area of confusion for a lot of people because they think that sound absorption, some sort of material that absorbs sound, also stops sound. But that's not really true. Imagine taking a piece of, say, acoustic foam and holding it around your head. You could still hear perfectly well. It might be a little muffled sounding, but it's not stopping the sound from coming into your ears. And in the same way, acoustical treatment on your walls does not stop the sound from going outside of your walls. Now, adding absorptive material like that to the walls might provide a couple of dB better isolation than if you didn't have that, but in reality, it's insignificant. The way you achieve isolation between you and the outside world is mass. You have to have something heavy. In the case of our basement, it's concrete block, and on the other side of that is earth. You can't get much more massive than that, and that provides just about ideal isolation with the outside. But there's another factor to consider, and that is that not only does that have to be massive, but it also has to be tightly sealed. Imagine if you just took rocks, pretty massive items, and just stacked them up, and that became your studio wall. Well, it probably has gaps in between every rock, and the isolation from one side to the other is practically nil, because that sound can find ways through those cracks to the other side. What's often overlooked by people building studios, even professional studios occasionally, is that it only takes a tiny amount of a crack to compromise your sound isolation significantly. For example, if you had a crack along the edge, say between where the top of your massive wall met the ceiling, a space only minute that you could barely see light through, but yet over the length of the wall it amounted to maybe a square inch of space, your sound isolation will be dropped about in half. So not only does the wall have to be massive, but it has to be solidly sealed. When I'm working with contractors on studio construction, I explain this to them, and in order to make my point, I tell them when we're done with this project, we're going to fill this room with water, and if it leaks, you don't get paid. And everybody laughs, but the point is made that this has to be perfectly sealed up. There can't be any gaps anywhere. And what you use to fill any gaps that are remaining has to be as massive as the walls themselves. However, the weak link in most studio situations is the ceiling. In this case, our ceiling is just wood. What you can see is the subfloor, which is 3/4-inch plywood, and then on top of that is oak flooring. And that opens up into the upper stories of the building. This might sound like a nearly ideal situation, but in reality there are noises that we have to contend with here at the D.W. Fern Studios. One of the problems is we have a train that goes by. It's actually on the periphery of our property. It's a freight train that goes by a couple times a day. You usually don't hear the actual train or the train whistle or anything like that, but there is some subsonic rumble that sometimes gets into the recordings. That's pretty easy to filter out when necessary and hasn't proven to be a problem. The other area of acoustics we have to talk about in regard to our home studio has to do with the sound of the recording space. You've probably noticed that some of the best classic recordings ever made have a distinctive sound to them. Now, some of that comes about because of the musicians and the way the recordings were made, but a lot of it also has to do with the recording space where the records were made. It's very easy to pick out some of these spaces the instant you hear them because the sounds are so distinctive. Studio 2 at Abbey Road in London is a good example. Now, you're probably not going to have enough space to have that kind of distinctive sound, but you can certainly make your space sound as good as possible. And to do that, there's three main areas that we have to consider. The first one we're going to talk about is resonance. And this occurs in any closed space where certain wavelengths, certain frequencies in the audio spectrum are sustained much more loudly than others because of the spacing between the walls and the floor and the ceiling. This is inevitable. It happens in every space, and there's nothing you can really do about it. When you have parallel walls, you have definite resonances built up between those you can actually calculate by measuring the distance. Now, many studios are rectangular in shape to begin with. Studio 2 at Abbey Road, which is a wonderful sounding room, has parallel walls. It's a perfect rectangle. And yet that space sounds excellent. So having parallel walls and rectangular space to work in isn't necessarily a problem. On the other hand, if your space has the ability to have some non-parallel surfaces or different attached spaces to it, sometimes you can improve the acoustics significantly by utilizing those extra spaces. Our garage is an example. It would be completely rectangular except for this small additional area down at one end, which we use for storage. This helps break up some of the resonances in the room. Now, if you live in a house that was built within the last 50 or 60 years, chances are most of the rooms have dimensions that are multiple of 4 feet. This was done to ease construction because when standardized building materials came about, most of them were based on lengths of 4 feet. For example, sheets of drywall were typically 4 feet by 8 feet, and it saved a lot of cutting and patching if they could use whole sheets rather than cut them up. So you'll find many rooms that are multiples of that 4-foot length. They might be 16 by 20 with an 8-foot ceiling. This can create some terrible acoustic problems because when you have walls and ceilings and floors that are multiples of that 4-foot length, some of the resonances are intensified because they're sustained in multiple directions. Now, the worst possible example would be a room that was an exact cube. I don't think we run into too many of those, but you run into lots of rooms where the multiple between the walls are the same. So if you have a room that's, say, 16 by 16 feet, you're definitely going to have resonance problems. That coupled with an 8-foot ceiling, and it's going to sound very boomy and boxy in that room. There's some ways to get around that. One is to use what are called bass traps that are tuned to those frequencies that are a problem. And that can provide quite a bit of relief, but it's not the ideal solution because essentially what you've done is just modified the acoustics at those particular frequencies. The second area that we're going to talk about in terms of room acoustics is absorption. And this is what most people think of when they think of treating acoustical spaces. They think of things like acoustic tile in the ceiling or some sort of absorptive material on the walls, which could be acoustical foam that's made for that purpose, or it could be something improvised out of carpeting or out of drapery or something like that. Now, it's true that all those things are absorptive. Some of the sound that goes into them is not reflected back. That's the definition of absorption. The problem with most of those materials is that they're frequency selective in their absorption. Generally, they absorb high frequencies much more readily than they do low frequencies. So what you end up with is a situation where you don't have much absorption in the low and mid frequencies and a lot of absorption at the high frequencies. This tends to take some of the sparkle out of the recording and add a lot of muddy mid-range and bass that you really don't need in the recording. So when you use acoustic absorptive materials, keep that in mind, that what you're doing is mostly absorbing high frequencies. The third acoustical aspect that we're going to talk about is called diffusion. And this is a situation where the sound is not only just reflected, but it's reflected in multiple directions. Any degree of roughness in your surface will provide some degree of diffusion, but it takes quite a bit of roughness in order to provide useful diffusion. You can buy commercially available diffusers that are made out of wood or plastic and provide reflective surfaces at a variety of different depths. This provides more of a reverberant sound rather than a strict echo like you would get off a flat, hard surface. However, it takes a lot of depth to make a difference, and an inch or two isn't really going to do much for you. You can make your own diffusers out of strips of wood of random width and depth and space those randomly in a framework with absorptive material behind it. And if you do a significant area of your recording space with that kind of a device, it'll provide some diffusion for you. Here in the DW Fern recording studio in the basement of our shop, we have quite a bit of diffusion, which we didn't design but just happened to be there. And you may find the same thing exists in your situation. In our case, we have shelves and shelves and shelves of bins of parts. The bins are often made out of cardboard. The parts are loosely piled up inside there. There's metalwork that's covered with paper and provides a variety of different reflective surfaces behind the paper, and lots of just miscellaneous boxes and stuff on the shelves. This actually works very well for us, and the sound in this space actually turns out to be pretty good. Needless to say, in a small space, you're not going to have much useful reverberation. What you're actually going to have is much less than a second's worth of reverberation time. But this can add a lot to your recording and make it sound better than it would if the space was completely dead. So here are the things to keep in mind. In order to provide isolation between the sound you're making in the outside world and the outside world's noises in your recording, you need massive walls and ceiling and floor. Nothing stops sound except mass. The mass has to be properly sealed. In your recording space, if your walls and ceiling dimensions are multiples of each other, you're going to have to deal with some problems with resonance. Absorptive materials generally absorb high frequencies much more effectively than low frequencies, but things like floors to another part of the building, even walls in some cases, can provide some absorption in the mid and low frequencies. And diffusion is useful to break up the reflections within your room and make the sound more reverberant rather than just a strict echo.